Next reaction for this chapter is going to be oxidation of those alcohols. So this one only really works for primary and secondary alcohols. We'll talk about that later. But if you have a primary alcohol and you oxidize it, it's really not a very difficult reaction to figure out, because you just take, kind of like that last reaction, a hydrogen from here, and instead of the hydroxyl group, just the hydrogen off of that hydroxyl group. If you remove those, right, essentially creating a hydrogen molecule, a diatomic hydrogen molecule, you can use those electrons to make another bond between that carbon and that oxygen, and it turns this primary alcohol into an aldehyde. So we had aldehydes on our last chapter's reactions, right, as products. So you know that that's an aldehyde, that that's at the end of a chain. It's essentially the primary version of that carbonyl group that we'll talk about next chapter. But a primary alcohol turns into an aldehyde, whereas the secondary alcohol, same thing. I'm going to take a hydrogen from this carbon, I'm going to take that hydrogen from the hydroxyl group, and I'm just going to make a double bond there between that second carbon and that oxygen. And this time I have a ketone as a product. But again, this is one of the simplest reactions. It shouldn't be too difficult. You just take that one bond to an oxygen and turn it into a double bond. Right? That's why it's called an oxidation, is because you're gaining bonds to oxygen. Now those hydrogens again are lost, but in reality, we don't usually write those in. We don't need them. Most of the time, that hydrogen becomes part of said oxidizing agent, right? It's going to be removed by that oxidizing agent as you make that double bond. So it doesn't end up a free-floating product. It's not going to be its own thing. It's going to become part of something else that we don't really know, because we're not being very specific right now. So since we don't know what our oxidation agent is, our oxidizing agent is, we're not really worried what happens to those hydrogens. We just know that what was a hydroxyl group turns into that carbonyl group from the next chapter, right? So again, we just need to call it an aldehyde or a ketone. And it should be pretty obvious why I can't do this with my tertiary alcohol, because A, right, there's no hydrogen on this middle carbon for me to remove. B, if I was to create a double bond here, I'd have too many bonds on that carbon to begin with, so it's just not possible to oxidize a tertiary alcohol. So if you have that, you're just supposed to tell me no reaction. Otherwise, if it's primary or secondary, you should be able to make that aldehyde or ketone product. Don't really worry about giving me that hydrogen byproduct, because like I said, usually that ends up part of the oxidizing agent itself, and it wouldn't be a freestanding product anyway. But if you put it there, it wouldn't hurt anything. If you really want it there, you can. But usually I just leave that alone. I don't need it. So those are your oxidation reactions.